I was there the day King David brought the Ark of the Covenant into Jerusalem. It was a day like no other, full of rejoicing and celebration. The streets were packed with people, singing, dancing, and shouting praises to God. David, our king, was at the center of it all, leaping and dancing before the Lord with all his might. He wore a linen ephod, a simple garment, more fitting for a priest than a king. But that was David, humble, unashamed to honor God publicly. But Michal, David's wife, was nowhere to be found in that joyous crowd. I remember seeing her standing at the window, high up in the palace, watching everything from a distance. Her face was hard, her lips pursed tightly. I didn't understand it then. How could the daughter of King Saul, the queen herself, look on with such disdain? This was a moment of pure worship, a moment when the presence of God was coming into the city, and yet Michal's eyes were filled with something far darker, contempt. It hadn't always been this way. I remember the early days of Michal and David's marriage. She had once loved him fiercely, even defying her father, Saul, to protect David's life. Back then, she was bold and brave, smuggling David out of their home when Saul sought to kill him. She risked everything for him, her position, her safety, even her relationship with her father. But time has a way of changing people. Michal had been separated from David for years after Saul gave her to another man while David was on the run. When David became king, he demanded her back. But by then, something had shifted in Michal. I think the bitterness of being treated like a political pawn hardened her heart. She had been tossed between two men, used for alliances and power. She returned to David, but it was clear that the love she once had for him was long gone. And now, there she was, watching David from the palace window with nothing but scorn in her eyes. I can still hear the whispers from those standing near me, wondering why Michal wasn't down there with the rest of us, joining in the celebration. She was the queen, after all, but she chose isolation over joy, criticism over worship. When David finally returned home that evening, still glowing from the celebration, still filled with the joy of God's presence, Michal was waiting for him. But it wasn't a warm welcome. As soon as he stepped through the door, she lashed out at him. How the king of Israel has distinguished himself today, going around half-naked in full view of the slave girls of his servants as any vulgar fellow would. Her words dripped with sarcasm, her voice cutting through the joy like a blade. I was shocked. This was her husband, the man after God's own heart, and yet she spoke to him with such contempt. She wasn't just angry at his behavior, she was disgusted by his public display of worship. To Michal, David had humiliated himself by lowering his royal dignity in front of the people. She couldn't understand the heart behind his actions, the passion he had for God. All she saw was a king who, in her eyes, had acted beneath his station. David's response was swift and direct. It was before the Lord, who chose me rather than your father or anyone from his house when he appointed me ruler over the Lord's people Israel, I will celebrate before the Lord. I will become even more undignified than this, and I will be humiliated in my own eyes. His words struck deep. David wasn't ashamed of his worship, no matter how undignified it looked to Michal. He wasn't concerned with appearances or status. To him, honoring God came above all else, and if that meant dancing in a linen ephod before the people, then so be it. But Michal, she had lost sight of what truly mattered. She had become more concerned with appearances, with maintaining royal decorum, than with honoring God. And that was her downfall. From that day forward, the rift between Michal and David only grew wider. But it wasn't just the strain on their relationship that marked the turning point for Michal. There was a deeper, more profound consequence for her contempt of David's worship. Scripture says that Michal, the daughter of Saul, had no children to the day of her death. In ancient Israel, to be childless was considered a curse, a sign of divine disfavor. For Michal, this wasn't just about being denied the joy of motherhood. It was a tragic ending to her story, a mark of her separation from God's blessing. While David's line would go on to produce kings, and eventually, the Messiah himself, Michal's lineage came to a dead end. She had once been a queen, the daughter of a king, married to the most famous king in Israel's history. She had once loved fiercely and bravely. But somewhere along the way, her heart had hardened. Whether it was the bitterness of her past, the pain of being used as a political pawn, or the resentment she felt toward David's uninhibited worship, Michal allowed contempt to take root in her heart. She couldn't see beyond her own pride, her own anger. And in the end, it cost her everything. Michal's story is a warning. It's a reminder of what happens when we let pride and bitterness blind us to the things of God. She wasn't condemned for her anger alone. After all, everyone experiences hurt and resentment at times. But she allowed that bitterness to fester, to the point where she mocked and despised the very worship that brought life and joy to others. In the end, Michal wasn't just one of the bad girls of the Bible because of a single moment of scorn. It was the condition of her heart, cold, bitter, and closed off to God, that sealed her fate. And while David's legacy continued to flourish, Michal's story ended in barrenness, both physically and spiritually. You've just uncovered one of the most pivotal stories in our Bad Girls of the Bible series, where we dive deep into the choices that shaped history. Don't let the lesson stop here. Like this video if it gave you a fresh perspective, share it with others who need to hear these powerful truths, and subscribe to follow the rest of the series. Each story will challenge you, inspire you, and strengthen your walk with God. Join us on this journey of faith, where every decision counts.